with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. We did have someone comment that there wasn't sound. That is, if you guys aren't hearing us, please send a chat. I think we resolved that issue.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to chat through some best practices for using Essbase with JD Edwards as a back-end system for financial data primarily. As Melissa mentioned, with the Bean Consulting Group, we're an Oracle Hyperion EPM Gold partner, specializing in planning, Essbase, Hyperion financial management, and some of the related tools that are used with them, such as FDM and DRM. We have experience in a number of different vertical markets, including higher ed, utilities, healthcare, telco, financial services, as well as manufacturing and retail. Our agenda today, we're going to initially discuss briefly the JDE reporting landscape and some of the issues inherent with some of the tools that are available. Solution overview architectures with how can JD Edwards environment be integrated with Essbase. We'll talk about a couple of different options there. Briefly, I'll highlight some of the key JD Edwards database tables and fields that we utilize for integrating and pulling data out of JD Edwards and building financial reports. I'll talk a little bit about some design considerations, give a couple of examples of some SQL code that we use to pull the data out, and then I'll give a brief demo of Hyperion Financial Reporting connecting to Essbase, and then we'll open up for questions. So with that, I think as a starting point, we want to get a brief poll of the attendees here and see what you guys are currently using for your financial reporting with JD Edwards. So with that, I'll hand it back to Melissa to conduct the poll.
Okay, if you can please just choose if you're using Essbase for JDE reporting, another third-party financial reporting tool for JDE, or if you currently aren't using any additional tools for JDE reporting. Once we get the results in, I'll go ahead and share them, and this will just help us target the webinar. Okay, great. Waiting for a couple more results to come in, and then go ahead and share them. So it looks like the majority are using Essbase right now for JDE reporting, which is right on target with the purpose of this webinar, so that's great.
Great. And then we had a follow-up question briefly.
So are you satisfied with your current financial reporting solution for JDE? So keep in mind your answer to the previous question, and hopefully if you are, that's great. If not, we can target some of the issues as to why. Okay, go ahead and show those results. Looks like we're kind of split on that one, so that's good.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks everyone for participating in our little survey there. So if we now shift gears and let's talk a little bit about some of the options that are available with JD Edwards. You have Oracle Business Intelligence as an option. Insight Software has a number of solutions available. OneView Reporting is another option, and there are a number of others. But all of these solutions, we believe, have some inherent issues, and how they might interact with the data and display the data. Primarily, a lot of these solutions lack what we call a dynamic dimensional hierarchies, and I'll explain this and kind of show an example of this as we get into it. But that includes also the ability to assign consolidation operators to different accounts as they roll up. So in a lot of these tools, everything just adds up without having the ability to, say, potentially subtract something from something else and that sort of thing. The ability to do drill down expansion. The tools sometimes don't have the abilities to do that. Essbase, that's a native capability. And time awareness, so how does data flow and roll over time, from year to year, that sort of thing, right? Balance sheet accounts needs to, carry a balance over from one month to the other, whereas income statement accounts sort of add up and that sort of thing. And so the ability to have that awareness of how things roll over time is important as well. Some of these tools also have some formatting limitations. I know a number of the more native JDE reports are, designed for dot matrix and that kind of thing, and are not, really PDF quality reporting. So financial reports, Hyperion financial reports with Essbase gives you the ability to get true pixel perfect PDF quality types of reports. And you can also book your reports together. So I can, say, have 3 or 4 different reports that I run on a monthly basis. I can combine those together into what's called a book and run that book in a single report. So I don't have to go and run 4 or 5 or how many, maybe a dozen or more reports on a monthly basis. I can do that all as one single process, and I can distribute those books out to people. And then lastly, there may be some performance issues with some of these tools as they're hitting your JD Edwards environment directly. So let's just talk a little bit about kind of the difference between Essbase and JD Edwards. Right? Essbase is an OLAP database that's really designed for analytics and for querying the data and drilling and pivoting and that sort of thing. Relational databases, which JD Edwards sits on top, are designed more for transactional purposes, and trying to perform queries against those relational databases sometimes can have significant performance impacts. So we try to align these things such that our relational data can map into our OLAP database, and we do that by using segments of the JD Edwards chart string in order to map those things into what we call dimensions. So in this example here, right, our JD Edwards database our chart string might include an account, a year, a period, a product, a store, and we could have other segments to this chart string, maybe a business unit or what have you. Each of these things then typically will map into what we call a dimension. As you can see here in this example, right, 51100 might be the account number, fiscal year 12, February, and so on and so forth. So that's how we align our relational data from JD Edwards into our Essbase cube. From a solution architecture perspective, there are 3 options, really. The first one that I display here is a direct integration with JD Edwards using what we call SQL load rules to load data directly from your JD Edwards tables to our Essbase cubes. In this case, we have SQL code that exists within our Essbase load rule, and it connects directly to the Edwards tables. This is very, very useful from the perspective of the data is very fresh, right? Every time we run a load process from Edwards to our Essbase cubes, the data is very fresh in that context. The downside to that is if you're running this process perhaps multiple times through a day for some reason, maybe it's during the monthly close or something like that, you can put a significant amount of burden on your JD Edwards environment, running those queries repeatedly during the course of a day. The next option is what we call a data file export. So we might export our data from JD Edwards into some flat files using SQL extracts out of JD Edwards, and then using load rules to load the data from those files directly into Essbase. In this circumstance, we take some of the performance impacts off the table, and we're no longer hitting JD Edwards directly every time we run that process. But in this case, if we're if our data hasn't been extracted, in a day or two, these data files could be a little bit stale. So you have, we've eliminated the performance implications of directly connecting to JD Edwards, but we've now created an environment where perhaps this data might be a little bit stale, and it's not necessarily structured in the best way potentially for loading to Essbase or for use in perhaps some other tools as well. And so the third option is using what we call a staging warehouse. So in this case, right, we have SQL extracts that pull the data out of JD Edwards, load that data into a star schema typically that is a staging area or a data warehouse of some kind. In this case, the data is in much better organized for use with Essbase and other reporting tools. We still have perhaps that data latency issue of, depending on how frequently our warehouse is being refreshed from JD Edwards. We may not have the freshest of data, but we have again eliminated some of that performance, those performance impacts of connecting directly to JD Edwards on a repeated basis and pulling data. So when we talk about building financial reports from JD Edwards, some of the key tables that we look at are these tables that we've listed here. So the FO901, the chart of account master table, the FO902 account balances where we actually get our data from, business unit master, some of these other tables here we use to actually build the dimensions, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And we use the UDC table, the user-defined codes table, to allow us to create mappings or how accounts might map into an Essbase hierarchy, account hierarchy. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. Specifically for the account master table, just a few of the fields that are of interest: the account ID, the object account category codes. These user-defined codes may be used to define where an account resides in a hierarchical roll-up, and this can be used to automate the process of building dimensions and adding accounts to your Essbase reporting solution as they get added to your JD Edwards system. Same thing here, business unit master, again, same number of the fields here. Again, primarily of primary interest are these category codes that again allow us to assign properties and assign hierarchy roll-up locations for the business units. The user-defined codes, right? This is where we'd actually create our user-defined codes and that would be used then to assign to accounts and business units and so forth. And our account balances, this is where we actually pull our data, both financial and operational, if we're looking at operating data as well. So this is where we'd actually pull our data in the month by month here for the January through the end of the year. So a few considerations from a design perspective. The ledger types, as they're assigned in JD Edwards typically are mapped into what we call scenarios and versions within Essbase. So our AA actual ledger type in JD Edwards would be mapped to an actual scenario in Essbase. And if there are budgets and forecasts that are created or loaded in JD Edwards, they can be pulled out and mapped as well into scenarios and versions. In addition, we can manage currency if the conversions are done in JD Edwards and we don't want to have a separate currency dimension. We can use do the same sort of thing to map those potentially into scenarios and versions. I've talked about using category codes as a mechanism to define the reporting hierarchy structures for accounts and business units and other segments that map into dimensions. Again, a very useful way of managing how those accounts are assigned to their particular roll-ups in the dimensions, and also in other reporting attributes. So, we may want to tag these accounts with some additional properties that allow us to do additional reporting or more advanced reporting. One of the other considerations for doing JD Edwards financial reporting through Essbase is the retained earnings posting. Excuse me. Typically in a JD Edwards environment, our retained earnings are only posted annually. So as we roll from month to month, those retained earnings that are accumulated in JD Edwards don't get posted to the balance sheet until the actual end of the year. So if you're doing mid-year reporting of income statement and balance sheet, you have to have a mechanism for posting your retained earnings to your balance sheet on a month-to-month basis so that your income statement and balance sheet all tie out correctly. And so we have a mechanism for pulling that data from your income statement cube to your balance sheet cube, such that those retained earnings are loaded to the balance sheet, and the income statement and balance sheet remain in balance. And then lastly, for those of you that are on AS400s, there's some slight difference in the SQL code that we use to load data and pull members, accounts, and business units out of the master tables to build the hierarchies. So again, that's something to consider as you're looking at these, looking to Essbase as a financial reporting solution. Just a couple of examples here of some SQL code. In this case, in this example here, we're pulling accounts and descriptions from the FO901, so that's our account master table. And we're pulling all the accounts that have actual data in USD or USD currency. And overall, this SQL code is really used to pull all of the accounts that would be defined or would exist in the account hierarchy in Essbase. So this is what we call some code that would be used for dimension build. This doesn't define how things roll up necessarily, so we don't have any category codes linked in here, but you could, and we have the ability to attach or link those category codes to the account so that we have that information about where the account resides within the account hierarchy as well. And then another example here, this is an example of actually pulling our data from October through September. In this case, in this example here, they're on a fiscal year of October to September, and they're on an AS400, so we had to use this lateral, we had to use this lateral statement within the SQL code to pivot our our months from the rows to the columns so that we had a column for each month of data to load. In addition, you might notice here we've combined our month and year periods, or our month and years, into a single dimension rather than keeping them separate. And we did that because these guys, in this example here, these guys are on a 445 on a quarterly basis. So not all the days of a particular month fall into that month from a fiscal perspective. So for example, October 31st might actually fall into the November fiscal period. And in that case, we wanted to be able to manage how those things rolled together, since they, since the break off or the break point for a particular month would vary from year to year. So simplified the process by kind of merging those things together. In this case, we're looking just at income statements, so where our object accounts are between 5,000 and 99,000, or 9,999. So with that, I'll jump in and just show a quick demonstration here of a few things. So what I'm showing here is an account or an outline within Essbase. So for those of you that are using Essbase, this should look very familiar. In this case, I'm looking at the account hierarchy, and I can actually drill down here and see how these accounts roll up. So in this case, we might attach to these accounts in our, on the JDE Edwards side, we might attach the parent account. So 251100, this account rolls up to 251000. So we might attach that as a parent account that tells us how these things roll up. In this case, the numbers sort of tell us how things roll up as well, so we can build logic to define that also. But if there were higher level roll-ups that were non-numeric, we could use those user-defined properties in Edwards to define how those things roll up. In addition, you notice the aggregation operators here. So for example, right, our balance sheet takes all of our assets minus our liabilities, so we're able to dynamically assign those aggregation operators and have the data roll up according to the actual operators here. Just some of the other dimensions: scenario, year, currency, segment, entity. Right, these again would be sort of the segments within your JDE Edwards chart string. And if I want to actually see what a report looks like, here you can see, and I'm showing it both in this report in both an HTML and a PDF format version. In our HTML version, you notice here we actually have the ability to dynamically drill down. A little slow there, but you can see here I've kind of drilled into net revenue that then shows me gross revenue, returns, and allowances, and I can continue to drill down into gross revenue and see, in this case, that the revenue here is in our revenue synergies account. So in an HTML version of the report, I have this ability to really do some analysis and kind of drill down on the report. And then the PDF version of the report here, you can see is pixel perfect. It prints out exactly as it looks and is very useful for distribution to the organization, board of directors, that sort of thing. Again, these reports can all be booked up. So if I have multiple reports here, in this case I'm looking at an income statement, but if I had a balance sheet and a cash flow statement that I ran on a monthly basis, I could create a book that included all three of those reports, and I could just run that book on a monthly basis. In addition, I can break this report on business unit or that sort of thing. So you can see here it's France sales, but I can pick another entity and it will update here and run for a different business unit. Give that a quick try here. Nope, no data there. See if I can find some data here. No. Well, my apologies. I knew if I went off script here, I'd not be able to find some data. But hopefully, you get the gist here that we can pick different business units and run those reports that way as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions.
Great, thanks. So if anyone has any questions, just type them in the questions console and we'll be sure to get those answered. Like I said, Chris does have over 20 years experience, so for those who answered in the poll that they aren't satisfied with their reporting, this is a great time to get those questions answered. Okay, Chris, there's one question. Can you do automated dimension builds plot updates from JDE to Essbase?
Yes, you can. And there are several mechanisms. It depends on how the metadata or how the accounts are structured in JD Edwards. As I had mentioned, we can use user-defined codes to define how the accounts roll up so that we can automatically add those accounts to the appropriate location in the account hierarchy as they're added to JD Edwards. And if they're more numeric in nature, such as the example I showed, we can actually define mappings that define how those numbers roll up to one another as well.
Great, thank you. Next question. Is it best practice to have separate cubes for B/S and I/S rather than have them separate roll-ups in the same?
I'm going to say that depends a little bit. Depends on the number of accounts that you have in your cube. It certainly creates a nice breakpoint between them. So I guess that, I don't know if that really answers the question, but if you have lots and lots of accounts, say on the order of thousands of accounts both in your balance sheet and your income statement, it might make sense to keep those as separate cubes. If you're talking about, you know, a couple hundred accounts in your income statement and the same for your balance sheet, then definitely you could perhaps have those in a single cube.
Okay. I don't see any more questions at this time. If anyone has, have you handled a statistic versus dynamic hierarchy for historical purposes?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Have you handled a static versus dynamic hierarchy for historical purposes?
A static versus dynamic hierarchy for historical purposes? I can't say as I have. I'm not sure what the benefit of a static hierarchy would be. I guess perhaps you don't want to add things to it over time, but you can. I suppose you could retain sort of an alternate hierarchy that defined how things were viewed historically. If you go through some major reorg or restructuring of your account structure, you may want to have an alternate hierarchy that allows you to report how things were historically.
Yeah, I think that to be able to change results already reported. Kind of a follow-up to that question.
Yeah. So yes, definitely you can have alternate hierarchies that allow you to report historically if you've done some sort of reorganization.
Great. Hopefully that answered all of your questions. If not, Chris, will you put up your contact information? We can reach you out. Chris, another question. How much effort to create the GW solution on average?
How much effort to create the data warehouse solution? We have some partners that have templates in place to build that data warehouse solution. So they have the ability to pull the data and build that star schema fairly quickly. I would say, it's going to depend somewhat on how well organized your data is in your JD Edwards environment. If it's been designed in such a way to facilitate a star schema, then the effort should not be a huge amount, probably. To actually build the warehouse and start getting it loaded, you're talking about less than a month. Validating the data in the warehouse, obviously that's where perhaps the larger effort would come in. And again, that goes back to how well organized the data is on the Edwards side. Hopefully that answered that.
Yeah. Do you have a slide with your contact information, Chris, in case anyone has a follow-up question?
I sure do.
Great. I'm not seeing any more questions come through, so thank you everyone for your time today. And if you do have any more questions, feel free to reach out to Chris. His contact is on the screen.